my top 10 books that I've read in 2025. So I am filming this middle of the year. These are the books that I've read so far, my top 10 for the first half of the year. I have read 35 books this year. So of those 35, these are my top 10. I do have a few criteria. Number one criteria is I'm not including any rereads, but since I only reread one book this year, it doesn't narrow it down very much. And my other criteria is my top 10 list is in the order of how much I still think about these books. So 10 being the book I think about the least on this list, and number 1 being the book that I think about the most on this list. So coming in at number 10 is The Midnight Library. This book surprised me. I read this for an in-person book club and I wasn't actually sure how much I would enjoy this book, but I ended up really liking it. I had a good time with it. So The Midnight Library is about this woman who is depressed, is having a really hard time in life, and she gets the opportunity to go to the Midnight Library, which is this state between life and death. And in the library, she can pick up any book off of the shelf and be transported to that life. The books in the library are different versions of her life. If she made different decisions, if she decided to date that guy that one night instead of turning him down, if she decided to marry her boyfriend instead of breaking up with him, all of these things in her life, if she decided to pursue certain things in her life, like she was really good at swimming, if she decided to pursue swimming as a career instead of giving up on that, if she decided to pursue music as a career instead of giving up on that, or even just doing it very casually as a hobby, or sometimes being a music teacher as she is in her current life, how would her life be different? And she starts to realize that each of these lives, while there are things that she likes about them, while there are things that she's happy with in them, they're all missing something. And in some ways, the way that her life went is the way that she ended up meeting some of her friends that she loves and that she cares a lot about. Like, there's so many, I guess, different threads you can pull on this of if one thing was different, you wouldn't end up where you are now. And in some ways, I've thought some of this stuff in my life, if I chose a different college, if I chose a different career in college, a different degree program, how many things, the people that I met during that time, I wouldn't have ended up meeting if I went somewhere else, if I chose a different career program, degree program, because I sometimes think about even going back of maybe I could go back and change my career, get a new career now. And whether or not I do that is also going to dramatically change who I end up meeting and what I end up doing in life. And it is interesting to think about those things, but in some ways I have a lot of blessings in my life too because of the path that I ended up on. Coming in at number 9 is Say a Little Prayer. This is a fun book, but it was also kind of a healing experience for me. This is about a teen girl who is forced to go to church camp and she does not want to be there. But while she's there, she decides, there's 7 days of camp, and then the theme around camp is about the 7 deadly sins. So she's decided to commit every one of the 7 deadly sins. She's going to try to do one each day while she's at church camp. And this goes disastrously wrong, and she ends up falling for the pastor's daughter, who is also at church camp. I got the audiobook for this one the day it came out, and I listened to it in one day. I couldn't put it down. I was just it's such a fun story. And I also thought it handled subjects of religion, of bigotry around homosexuality very well. She's in a world that is unaccepting, but she does have other people in her life who are accepting, and it really just helps her in her journey. And I thought It ended like honestly the best that it could, and I had a lot of fun with this book. Coming in at number 8 on a much more serious topic is Mainline Mama. This is a memoir of a woman who is raising her child by herself because the dad is in prison. And she talks a lot about the prison visits, trying to raise the child and have the child know their dad, meeting other people who were in the same circumstance and connecting with them, learning from them of how to work the system so that way they have the most time. And because like she literally talked about people waiting in line. They would have visitation hours and people would line up starting the night before so that way they could get in during those visitation hours. Talking about like what they're allowed to wear or what they're allowed to bring in. She talks about she had her wedding in prison because she got married to the man that was in prison, that was the father of her child. So while he was still in prison, and she talks about, you know, getting someone to come down to officiate the wedding and getting her whole family to come in, just honestly telling her own personal story. It starts when she's like a teenager, and it talks about her life, her family life, how she ended up meeting this person, how they got involved, all of that. And then it goes through, like, I guess spoilers, she does end up breaking up with him and divorcing him, but then she does continue to do work for other people who are in similar circumstances to the circumstances she was in, and trying to help those people the best she can. So really interesting, very insightful for me because I've not been in these circumstances, and a lot of this stuff like I just was not aware of. So it was very insightful for me to read this. Coming in at number 7 is Clean. So I don't read a lot of contemporaries or thrillers or domestic thrillers or whatever this book is. And I read this because Page Turners with Keeonna was doing the Reading the Globe challenge, and this was the book that we read together in January. Now, I've not kept up with reading all of the books this year, but I really appreciated the discussions around this one. I appreciated getting to read this one with everyone. So this story starts, we meet this maid as she is being interrogated because the child she was caring for was found dead. And the maid says she didn't do it, and she's going to explain why, and she's going to explain the entire story leading up to her being imprisoned. And we get the story from her perspective, and it's so interesting because by the time we get to the end of the story, I realize that like we are getting the story through her perspective, which is not necessarily the entire story, and she might be interpreting certain scenes wrong because by the time we get to the end, I'm like, oh, I don't think there's like a particular thing that happens that I'm like, I don't think she's interpreting what happened correctly. And then that makes me question like the entire story that we've been told up until this point. And that it's such an interesting way of telling the story. And then it also kind of doesn't exactly tell you who did it at the end. It is open, like the maid tells you what exactly happened, but I'm not sure if I believe her by the time we get to the end of the book. I'm not sure if I believe her anymore. And so then I am left going, do I believe her version of events? Do I believe that what happened, who did it? Or do I decide to maybe reinterpret some of these events and figure maybe she's wrong? And that is so interesting. It's also like a little bit of a commentary on the fact that she is giving up her life to care for this child that's not even hers. And I feel like right at the end, like the last couple lines is also just like speaking directly to the reader about those circumstances. And it's so interesting. And I think maybe it's because it's so different from stuff that I typically read is why it's something that I still reflect on and go back to. Coming in at number 6 is In the Shadow of the Moon. This is another nonfiction book, and this one is about the space race. And I found this one very interesting. Some of this stuff I already knew about previously, and then some of it I wasn't really aware of, or I was only like vaguely aware, but I didn't know the details. And I thought this book did an excellent job explaining things around the space race. It also tried to look at the space race from both the Soviet Union's point of view and the United States' point of view. It talked about the successes and failures on both sides. It talked about some of the brains behind these projects, because it also talked about Operation Paperclip, where both the US and the Soviets, like, people were trying to like basically poach German scientists post World War II, because they were like, we want your brains working for us. And I don't know, it was interesting. So we kind of like followed these two people and how they ended up like where they were, one in Russia and then one in the United States. Honestly, and I feel like this book really tried to be balanced about how it approached the space race and not just be one-sided, as most space race books often are. Not that I read like that many nonfiction books about it, but I'm going to say particularly like fiction books about it can be very one-sided, which makes sense if you're following characters on one side of the story. But this book, I appreciate its dedication to looking at both sides of the space race. I sometimes think it then ended up trying to compare things that, well, there was just this one instance where I was like, I don't know if that's comparable. So it talked about this space disaster that the Soviet Union had, where people working on these rockets and people like astronauts ended up dead. And they lied about what happened because they didn't want to say that it was a space disaster. So they were like, oh, this was someone who was a plane pilot, and oh, their airplane crashed and that's why they died. So they lied about what happened because they didn't want it to get out that they messed up. And then the book said, but the US were also concealing things from the public, and then goes into how the US wanted its astronauts to be seen as like very upstanding, honorable men. And to the point that whenever they was known some of the astronauts were having affairs or whatever, they tried to keep this from the press. They tried to conceal this as much as possible because they didn't want it getting out that these men might not be all that they're making, you know, I guess the pinnacle of like the American man. I don't know. Here's the thing. I understand I'm reading this book in 2025. So to me, it's a little bit less scandalous if one of the astronauts was in an affair. Okay? Probably at the time it was more scandalous than it is in 2025. So I'm aware that I am reading my own biases into this story. But I also think it's not really comparable to say like, oh, the Soviets were lying about how the people died, even to the families, because they didn't want it known that they had a disaster. And then the US was lying about the fact that these guys were in, you know, happy marriages when they were actually in an affair. It doesn't really seem comparable. Most of the other comparisons made a lot of sense to me. So I do appreciate the book's dedication to, we're going to try to view this from both sides. Coming in at number 5, we have James. This one was one that I was not actually sure where to put on this list. I could have put this in different places because, and I think part of the problem is I just read James. I finished it recently. And that's making it hard for me to place it on this list because it's like, this is a list of books that I still think about after the fact. And I think this is going to be one that I continue to still think about after the fact. But it's kind of hard to place whenever it's like, it's very recent. I'm still really thinking about it. So James is a retelling of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn from Jim's perspective. So I read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn for the first time. And then I went into James immediately afterwards, and I so appreciate the conversation James had with the source material and the new take it had on the story. You know, it it goes, oh, you thought this is what was going on, here's really what was going on behind the scenes. And it makes it so it's plausible that these two stories could align. And this is really what was, the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is from Huckleberry's perspective. And Huck is the one writing the story. So what we're getting is through Huck's interpretation, whereas James is also through James' perspective, but James has a lot more going on than he does in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He is a lot more intelligent, he's literate, he can read and write, and he can have conversations with philosophers, and it's so interesting. And I have a reading vlog that I will be putting out on this. I really appreciated the end of this book, and I think it also had a lot to say by the way that it ended. And it's definitely one that I still think about. It's also very popular, so it's one that I've had conversations with people in real life more often about. Coming in at number 4 is Fair Play. The reason this one is so high on the list is it's very relevant to things today. So Fair Play is about the history of sports, particularly gender segregation in sports, and it's talking about how do we make sports fair, and are there people who have unfair advantages? Why were sports segregated in the first place? Some of it's just sexism. There are also reasons why sports end up segregated, even because it talked about a sport that is much more recently gender segregated, because previously there hadn't been gender divisions. And it also it's specifically focusing on transgender athletes in sports, and it talks primarily about transgender women in sports, but then it also examines why aren't we talking about transgender men in sports, and trying to find those stories. It talks about real life stories on both sides of this. The book tries to just examine these things and examine what is fairness in sports and give you a lot of information. And then by the end of the book, there is one chapter where the author talks about their opinion on this. And they specifically say you can come to a different opinion. They're not trying to tell you what to think, but this is their thoughts on it. And I appreciated that. So I read this, and I also listened to the Tested podcast while I was listening to this. And I actually came to a different conclusion than the author. We agree on a lot of core things, but I think I'm a lot more idealistic whenever I look at the world and how it should run. So I'm like, we can just, ignore the current system, start from scratch. Let's build up what would be ideal. And the author is like, gender segregated sports is not going away. We have to work within the system. And they base their opinion on that. So I think it's just we're looking at the problem differently, and they're maybe a little bit more realistic than I am. Coming in at number 3 is Are Prisons Obsolete? Which this book is a book I think about because I think about fairness and justice and what is justice and how should people be accountable for things and all of that stuff so much. And this book really talks about all of those questions. No, it does not talk about all of those questions, but it does talk about our current justice system and the problems with it. This book, the first part focuses on talking about current statistics, current conditions, and then the final chapter is really just drawing that all together and then making an argument for prison abolition and a better way forward. It also talks about little steps we can take now to improve things for the future. And this is stuff that I think about a lot. And then particularly, I'm gonna say, reading fantasy books, reading science fiction books, reading books with messed up worlds sometimes, then also makes me think about this, as well as like all of the stuff in real life. And particularly whenever I'm wanting to read about characters and learning their motivations and why do people do what they do and all of that kind of stuff, it does make me consider all of these questions. And I really appreciated this book. I read it in one day. And I listened to the audio version of it. It is read by the author, and I completed it in one day, and in like one sitting. I was like, oh my gosh, I have to like finish this, and I'm probably going to revisit it many times. Coming in at number 2 is a little bit of a surprise one on this list. It is A Strange and Stubborn Endurance. So I read this because Lady Mare Reads made a video that was like, are there actually good romantasy books out there? And then she just talked about this series and how much she loved it. And I was like, well, I guess I have to try it because she recommended it. So I read it and I loved it. This story at its core is about a character who's leaving the only world he ever knows, and he's going to a different world, a different land, and he feels a lot of freedom. He's able to express himself how he's never expressed himself before, but it's also very uncomfortable to do that because he's not used to that. That's not the norm, and he has to navigate figuring out all of those things and figuring out what, you know, he wants as well. This is also a story of healing, so there is on-page sexual violence at the beginning of the story, and then our main character is healing from that throughout the story, but I mean, some of that includes lashing out at people that are not deserving of being lashed out at. And I thought it was handled very well throughout the story. I also just loved the characters in this story. I fell in love with the characters. There is also like an assassination plot, and there's like this mystery going on. And this was a book literally that the characters were investigating the mystery. And I was like, can we go back to when they were sitting in their room having conversations about life? Because like, I was really enjoying that. And now we're out here doing plot things, and I just want to get back to like the character moments, just like dual life together. I enjoyed that. So yeah, I fell in love with these characters. Also, like for the first several chapters, we just follow Velicent. And then we switch and we get another perspective. We get Keithari's perspective. And the very first time it switched, I was like, no, I was like invested in Velicent's perspective. I don't want to switch to a new character. And then I fell in love with Keithari. And we do go back and forth between those characters. And it is delightful. It's also talking about trauma and like a traumatic story. But it's also like a hopeful story. And coming in at number 1, I have We Do Not Part. This is one that has not left my brain since I read it. And I don't even know how best to describe this book. We are following 2 characters, and they were both working on this documentary project that would talk about this major massacre that happened decades ago and then was actually made illegal to talk about. Like, no one was allowed to talk about this massacre after it happened. And then after decades passed, those restrictions have been lifted. They are allowed to talk about it. And they grew up hearing whispers of these stories, and they are wanting to make a documentary memorial to these stories. But one of them, in the process of making this, gets injured and goes to the hospital. And then the other one, the person who's in the hospital says, hey, can you go to my house and take care of my birds? They will need fresh water by the end of the day. And half of the book is literally just the other character journeying in the snow because she gets caught up in snowstorms. There's a lot of delays in transportation, and she's reflecting on all of these things in life as the snow is getting heavier, and she's traveling to the house where the birds are and trying to make sure she gets there in time. And there is this line in the book about, you know, what is the end of the day for a bird? And then we also consider what is the end of the day for humans. It's very existential. I enjoy it. There's also so much symbolism where it's talking about one thing in a scene and might also be talking about other things. A lot of it, the cycle of life, the water cycle, is connected in a way that it's so interesting. And it's also like the story is called We Do Not Part. It's about how those who have passed before us haven't actually left us, and the imprint that they leave and the cycle that continues. And I feel like this is a book, like, I don't get everything out of it the first time, and I would need to go back and like reread it to even like pick up more and more things from this story. So those are the top 10 books that I have been thinking about the most since I finished reading them. Talk to me in the comments if you've read any of these and what your top 10 are that you still think about that you've read this year. And I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading.